everyone. I'm Sally, editor at Aeon Magazine, and it is my pleasure today to speak with Dr. Arthur Caplan. The doctors William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor of Bioethics at the Department of Population Health at New York University, as well as the founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU School of Medicine. So throughout his long career, Professor Caplan has made significant contributions to the field of bioethics, and indeed, some call him the founding father of bioethics. He's the author of numerous books and hundreds of articles, as well as testifying on national and international committees on subjects including organ and tissue transplants, gene editing, artificial intelligence, end-of-life care, and public health emergencies and disaster response. So today we're going to talk about the arc of Professor Caplan's long career, what motivates him as a researcher, and the new frontiers he sees emerging in the field of biomedical ethics. So Professor Caplan, welcome. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me, Professor Caplan, I described you in my introduction as the founding father of bioethics. What does that mean to you? And is that title accurate?
It's not accurate, but it's sometimes said. The founders were people like Dan Callahan, Will Galen, many of the faculty, Andre Helligers at the Kennedy Institute at Georgetown, Sam Gorovitz, who did a lot of early work in medical ethics with NIH summer seminars, training a lot of people. I'm actually the next generation. I'm not one of the founders, but I will confess to a slightly different role, and that is to take the field of bioethics public, move it not just as an academic enterprise. Its first founders had to gain legitimacy for it within the academy. I always felt that it was also important to try and speak to people beyond the academy. So that visibility confuses some people, and they say, well, he must be the first, because they hadn't heard of some of the other folks before me.
That's really interesting. Can you talk to me a little bit more about your personal journey into bioethics and what brought you to the field? Was it something you were always passionate about, or when did you discover it?
Well, when I decided to get interested in bioethics, it still wasn't a field. It was just a twinkle in a few eyeballs at that point. It wasn't really a field out there. And I had gotten interested, I'll give you the sort of Freudian roots and then the more experiential roots. When I was a young kid, I had polio. I must have been one of the last people who got polio in the North America anyway. And I wound up in the hospital for a year. And during that time where there were no cures, just physical therapy, heat treatments, which actually did nothing, but they hoped they might do something, heat pads, that sort of thing. I had a lot of time, even as a 7-year-old, to think about, why aren't they telling us the truth about what we have? They didn't. Why can't we have more visitors? They were very restricted. They managed to get my homework to me from the first grade, but I couldn't have my dog visit, and my sister never could visit. It was always parents only. My sister was like, probably at that time 4, so too young to come. And they didn't tell us the truth about what happened to the other kids. We knew that some of them were pretty sick, and then they would disappear and not come back. So it got me thinking at a very, very early age about some of the ethical issues in dealing with patients, in managing the care of someone who's got a long hospital stay and then many years of rehab. So I would say that was an early origin point for me about thinking about ethics in healthcare. Later, I went to Brandeis University for college. Very tumultuous time when I was there, lots of demonstrations and disputes about public events, be it the Vietnam War, be it race relations, feminism, early efforts at gay rights. And Brandeis was a good place to debate these things, a school that tolerated vigorous debate. Looked a little bit like some of the situations at schools around the world today in terms of debates over the fate of Gaza and the Israeli-Palestine war. But those events engaged me. I thought they're very interesting. I was a pre-med, but they made me take some courses in philosophy. And it turned out the philosophy courses that I took didn't really do much on contemporary events. They weren't very normative. They were more what we would call meta-ethical. They wanted to examine the question of could there be ethics, not what was the right thing to do. Nonetheless, I enjoyed them and sort of had a minor in philosophy. I thought I'd go to med school, but I wound up at Columbia Med School and decided I'd rather get interested in ethical issues because of what I'd seen in the hospital. People fighting about in vitro fertilization. We didn't have enough kidney dialysis machines. Who should get them? We were allowing newborn infants to die when their parents said their congenital defects were too serious, spina bifida, Down syndrome, they didn't want to take care of them. So many controversial issues. And I talked about this with some of the deans of the med school, and they said, well, if you want to talk about those issues, you discuss those with your attendings, the senior doctors in the particular area. That was hilarious because you would never ask ethical questions about your attending. You'd be out on the street or cleaning up the supply room or something. It wouldn't be tolerated at that time. So I decided I'd look into philosophy and maybe take a master's degree. Long story short, I got interested in the philosophy stuff, never went back to medical school, finished a PhD, but I did it in the philosophy of science, not ethics. And it got me interested, though. I wrote my dissertation on evolutionary theory and sociobiology. And there were a lot of ethical issues flying around the genetic basis of human behavior. That reinforced my interest in medical ethics. So it's a long road. There was no one to really mentor me. I thought you could put the two things together, medicine and ethics, but I wasn't sure how.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, hearing about how your career has kind of unfolded against the backdrop of US social history, I'm sort of, and speaking to your interest in engaging with the public, I'm left with a question as to what extent do you think public concerns kind of drive the field of bioethics, and to what extent do you think academic bioethics can push the public conversation in certain directions?
Well, when I went back to Columbia Med School, I started to teach a class, which, by the way, was horrible. I think I had 150 students, and by the end of it, I think I had 4. And I'm not sure they spoke English as a first language. It was horrible because I taught it as theories, and they didn't care. I realized shortly thereafter you had to teach it as cases and use a case-based approach, and that worked out fine. But during the time I was teaching that, I got interested in a problem that I had encountered, which was, as I said, I knew we didn't have enough dialysis machines to treat everybody with kidney failure. But I also knew that kidney transplants were beginning to appear and spread and become more common. And the problem, the limiting factor to get people off dialysis was we didn't have enough kidneys. So that meant, where do the kidneys come from? They come from the public. So if you want to boost up your kidney supply, you've got to boost up kidney donation. That led me to start to examine how we were requesting kidneys. And it turned out we weren't at Columbia systematically. We were just doing it when we thought, oh, maybe the family won't get nervous if we ask. A lot of places weren't asking at all. So one of the first legislative activities I got involved in was to pass a law in New York, and it turned out in Oregon, to require that families be asked about organ donation. They didn't have to give. It wasn't presumed consent or coerced donation. It was just giving them the opportunity. That worked. Organ donation rates and tissue donation rates, eyes and tendons and stuff, went up. So to answer your question, my first experience was to solve a problem, you've got to go public. We're never going to solve this if we just argue about it in the seminar room. We have to get people to change behavior. So that was an early lesson to me that in many bioethics areas, you must engage the public one way or another. And that has turned out to be true in areas like medical aid in dying, for example, even getting into arguments about reproductive technologies, abortion policies, in vitro fertilization policies. These are often set outside the academic philosophy or academic medicine arenas. So I've been a big believer that to get change, you often have to engage the public. Also, I realized if we're going to do this area, we've got to inform the public about what their rights are and what they can expect and ask for when they go to the hospital. It was great that we had good explorations in the literature, say the Hastings Center Report or the American Journal of Bioethics, or later the Journal of Medical Ethics and others, of issues. But if a patient wasn't up to snuff in terms of saying, I want an advance directive, or I'm going to pick a surrogate decision maker, we weren't, in my view, doing our job. So I've long had this belief, both to change policy and to empower patients, that you've got to be public. You've got to have what I sometimes these days call translational bioethics, like we have translational science. We have to be able to translate policies, arguments, findings out into the general public worldwide, by the way, so they can make appropriate decisions in their care. How well does bioethics do this? Well, when I started to do it, people hated it. They really wanted things to stay inside the academy, and there was a lot of sniping at me and a few others who were trying to do it, that this wasn't appropriate, and it delegitimated the field to try and do public lectures or to try and write opinion pieces in what was then the mainstream media on something, which I did, or to comment on things in the news. I just didn't think that was true. I don't want to say I ignored the critics, but I kind of did. It just wasn't, I just disagreed totally with the particular vision that was behind the critics, which often was stick to academics, stick to peer debate. On the other hand, as people know, I've done a lot of publishing, a lot of writing, a lot of articles, a lot of books. So I felt confident that I was qualified to speak publicly because I tried to stick to areas where I'd done some work. Bioethics is doing better today in being public. It recognizes social media. It recognizes the importance of public communication. Not everybody does it, but that's okay. We can have people who work in the trenches of theory and other people who are a little bit better communicating or excited more by that. So improved, I would say. Today, improved.
I was going to ask if it was harder now than it used to be, given the risks associated with, associated with public engagement because of the polarization of discourse, and particularly in the field of bioethics with things like vaccinations and the pandemic. But you seem to be painting a slightly more optimistic picture, that it's not necessary. It's harder in some respects, but easier in others.
Well, I put it this way. In the old days, your biggest critics were your peers. In current days, your biggest critics are the public you're trying to talk to. So it's not that it's better across the board. It's better within the field. People will give you credit. They don't just turn up their noses at somebody who tries to run a website or maintain some sort of a Substack or something like that. It's more accepted, not by everybody, but generally more widely. You're right. The tougher role today is to be in the public arena and then catch all the arrows that are aimed at you by all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons. Here, I'll say something that sounds a little bit self-aggrandizing, but that stuff doesn't bother me because I've been in the middle of these controversial areas for decades, and I'm used to having people threaten, insult, try to say they're going to kill you, and on and on. You get into areas like abortion, animal rights. Pretty soon you meet people with intensely different views. I was an early campaigner for fluoride in the water, and that had its own anti-vax type nuttiness 20, 30 years ago, which is coming back, unfortunately. So thick skin with me, been watching it for a long time, but many junior faculty that I talk to, mentor a little bit, you gotta say, be ready, be prepared, you're gonna get insulted, there are people gonna target you, there are people who may threaten you, and here's how to manage that, here's how to go forward with that. I wouldn't recommend that we let bullies stop us from communicating, but there are bullies.
It's interesting that the slings and arrows of public criticism doesn't necessarily affect you, and you've got quite a tough skin, as you said. But I'm curious to know, of the vast range of subjects that you've covered in your career, what has been the most personally challenging one for you?
I think the toughest one has been in neonatology and managing the fate of premature infants or if infants born with birth defects. When I first entered, as I said before, the field, or what was the emerging field, wasn't quite a field, we were letting babies die and publishing about that fact. It wasn't a secret. You could read articles in the New England Journal, in the Lancet, reports from teams saying, the last 10 births with spina bifida and Down syndrome, the parents said, don't treat, and we didn't, and we put them in the corner, and that was kind of the end of that. I kind of early on went along with the experts who said these kids aren't going to survive and their life is miserable. But later I met some of the parents who said treat and their kids, and they were doing well. They're, somebody with spina bifida had graduated college, and someone with Down syndrome was very happy and working in a supermarket. And it challenged my view about, well, what's quality of life? What's disability? How does that bear on how well can we forecast what's going to happen to newborns born with severe problems? So I think that's been, oddly enough, people might not have expected that, but that's been the hardest one for me, sort of managing expectations. And we get better at treating many of these conditions or handling prematurity. There has been a boundary of about 23 weeks when the fetus has no lungs and it can't survive. But rescuing low birth weight infants has been, improved. So you have to sort of think even harder about what you want to say to a parent or what their rights are to refuse treatment.
I think something that's very admirable about that story is the kind of intellectual humility it takes to be able to change your mind about something. And this comes back to the kind of very public lives that we're now forced to lead. Especially in the case of, overtly engaging in public communication, but just by virtue of social media. What you maybe the answer to my following question you've already answered, but I'm really curious to know if there's a major question in bioethics that you've changed your mind about beyond this question of treatment of preterm infants, for example.
Yes, I'll give you two. When medical assistance in dying was first proposed, 1984-6 in Oregon, to make it legal, I was a critic and I opposed making it legal and opposed legislation in that area. I did that because I worried about abuse. I thought in America, we don't have a right to health care. Whatever one thinks about Canada or the UK national health systems, these people are inside something. We have a lot of people who have no right to get anything. So to put it bluntly, it seemed dangerous to me to create a right to be killed by the doctor before you had a right to see a doctor. And I worried that people would be rushed off to death if they looked like they were going to cost a lot of money, or families were saying, well, Art, we kind of need a college tuition fund. Let's let Art go a little quicker. We'll pressure him to use some sort of an exit. And people like Jack Kevorkian were around sort of proposing suicide on demand, which I thought was really a bad idea because you were picking up people with mental illness. And also he didn't know his patients. They came and he helped them die rather quickly. But Oregon implemented, despite my very on-point criticisms, and lo and behold, a couple years, no abuses. Nobody's getting rushed off. They built in safeguards. You have to wait and make a repeat request for the pills. You have to take the pills. You have to be diagnosed as terminally ill by, I think it's 2 doctors. Anyway, a lot of guide rails. that made the policy, in my opinion, safer. And I have come out and now support Oregon-style end-of-life care and have argued for it for maybe 2 decades. So the data just didn't bear out what I was worrying about. And the only people who seem to worry these days are the people who never liked it to begin with. But they're not paying attention to the fact that it has worked safely. Now, I know there are issues. Belgium, Holland have gone much further in eligibility for the right to die. Canada may be going further than the restricted US policy, but the restricted US policy has worked. There hasn't been a slope. So, and I'll tell you, want one more?
Why not? Why not?
All right. This was faster. When face transplants were first proposed, I thought, this is ridiculous. I haven't done many of them in animals. It may turn out that people who signed a donor card didn't mean their face, and maybe they're going to stop donating all their organs. So that's dangerous. And face transplant is aesthetic. It's nice to look better, but you don't want to risk killing people and putting them on dangerous immunosuppressive drugs just so they can look better. So I wrote that and offered those objections. And I've worked in transplant a long time. A lot of transplant surgeons and doctors and nurses know me. So they said, you're just wrong. You are making arguments that aren't convincing. And so they made me meet some of the people who needed face transplants and interview them. Quickly becomes evident it's not aesthetic, it's functional. They can't breathe, they can't cry, they can't do many of the functions, breathe easily, sleep easily, that they need a face and associated tissues to do. That argument that it's just aesthetic, well, it partly is aesthetic, is false. It's just not right. They didn't really need to do animal studies because all the techniques they use to do partial reconstruction of faces. There wasn't really a big need to go back. And I helped them solve the issue about negative impact on organ donation. We would only use people who had signed an organ donor card, but who for technical reasons couldn't be organ donors, maybe they had cancer or something. And we would approach them about the possibility of donating a face and also insist that their family give permission, which isn't really required under ordinary. You say you want to do it, your family sometimes tries to veto it, but they don't really have the authority to say yes or no. You do if you fill out a card or a computer registry. That's the model now used to obtain organs. All my objections fell away. I think I became a supporter of research on face transplants. And that's been very recently, over the past 7 or 8 years.
And so looking ahead, what do you think are the most pressing bioethical challenges that we're going to face in the next decade? And what should we be doing to prepare for them? What's preoccupying you at the moment as a bioethicist?
Well, let's see. What do we have? 3 hours, 4 hours to answer that? There's a lot of things going on. Obviously, one area that's exploding is paying attention to artificial intelligence. That's not news, but it is big and going to get bigger. I think right now there's too much hype around artificial intelligence. I don't really think we're ready to have a doctor robot or assign even coaching and therapy roles to AI online. It's good to augment how healthcare works, but it's not really, I mean, in the US, we have a system of electronic medical records called Epic. It is an early AI attempt to get away from paper records and big charts. It stinks. We can't even do that right. People will have complaints and complaints about it, and that isn't really something that requires a whole lot of AI intelligence. So not there yet, but certainly down the road, it's coming, and I think we will face issues about wiring ourselves into the cloud like Elon Musk proposes with his Neuralink models and this sort of thing. It's just down the road. I think another fascinating area is still the brain. Neuroethics, I think, will remain very, very exciting and interesting because we're mapping the brain like we mapped the genome, and a lot of the ethics issues of the past couple decades have resulted from personalized medicine, knowledge of genes. I think we're going to get that in the brain sciences and treating diseases with neural stimulation, but also different drugs that target different cells, how you worry about changing a personality or retaining personal identity. I think that's going to be a very interesting area. Another one is just trying to figure out, can the world fight pandemics together? Is it really going to have two standards, one for the rich and one for poor nations? We saw that with vaccine distribution in the COVID outbreaks. There will be more pandemics. I think we haven't fixed the system for surveillance, testing, distribution of medicines and vaccines. I don't think we learned a lot from the COVID experience, but I do think the challenges are international and they demand international thinking, work, cooperation, and bioethics can help that. Can't totally solve it, but it can help. One interesting thing going on within the field, there's a lot more reliance on empirical work in bioethics. Many people do studies, questionnaires, they do surveys, they might study decision trees to see how doctors make decisions about medicines. I think that's all well and good, but one of the ethical norms of social science tends to be, don't be normative. Describe what you do, lay out the facts, and then get out of there. That's not bioethics. And I think I'm worried a little bit that we have fewer philosophy, theology, legal voices to pick up on the empirical and translate that into behavior, recommendations, policies, even fights about what to do. I was part of the group many years ago that said bioethics should rest on a better empirical foundation. We need to take an empirical turn. But I think the turn has been very sharp. Last issue, within bioethics, at least the American version, we're still all crazed about autonomy and individualism. All day long, rights, individual choice, personal autonomy. I think that's not a strong enough ethic to guide healthcare in the world. It results in too many Americans with no healthcare because it's seen as something they have to earn or choose to pursue, which I think is ridiculous. And worldwide, I think there are other voices that are community-minded or group-minded or have an ethos that has to be listened to and integrated into how bioethics thinking goes. So I think that's a challenge of the future, is sort of developing a better other-oriented, community-oriented, beyond the individual ethos.
Well, I think that's a lovely note and a rather positive one on which to finish. It's been a real privilege talking to you. I mean, circling back to something we touched on at the start of the conversation, the sense of how bioethics has changed against this backdrop of history, but it's also been really fascinating, I think, to hear more about these different touch points in your career and how that maps onto your own personal journey. So yeah, it's just been wonderful to chat, Arthur. And thank you so much for being so open and for sharing your thoughts and insights so freely.
Thank you. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Arthur. And thank you to the Brochet Foundation.